There is an entry dated in the autumn of 1854, sitting in the private correspondence of a London banking house. It is not a diary entry. It is not a diplomatic cable. It is a calculation, a projection of returns on a loan made days before the guns went silent at Sevastopol, made before any general on either side knew how the siege would end. Someone had already done the math. You were taught that the Crimean War was fought over religion. Over the rights of Catholic and Orthodox monks to hold the keys to a handful of shrines in Jerusalem. Over the slow collapse of an Ottoman Empire, too weak to defend itself, too valuable to let fall into the wrong hands. You were taught that Britain and France went to war to stop Russia from swallowing the Bosphorus, and that thousands of young men died in the mud outside Sevastopol for the sake of a balance of power drawn up decades earlier in the salons of Vienna. That is the textbook version. It is not wrong. It is just incomplete. Because behind the treaties, behind the troop movements, behind the famous, doomed charge of 600 cavalrymen into a valley of Russian guns, there was another war being fought. Quieter, faster, far more profitable. It was fought not with rifles but with government bonds, not in the Black Sea but in the exchanges of London and Paris, and the men who fought it never set foot on a battlefield. We'll come back to that ledger entry. Because by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what it meant and exactly how much it was worth. Here's what the history books leave out. Modern warfare, even in the 1850s, required something no army could manufacture on its own: liquidity. Cash, in volumes no state treasury could produce from tax revenue alone. Britain, France, Russia, and the crumbling Ottoman state all needed the same thing at the same time: enormous sums of borrowed money, raised fast, to keep armies fed, supplied, and moving. Uniforms, rifles, gunpowder, ships, horses, hospitals. None of it arrived without capital first, and none of that capital existed inside any single government's treasury. There were only a handful of institutions in Europe capable of raising that kind of money on short notice. And that gave those institutions a kind of power no army possessed: the power to decide, quietly, who could afford to keep fighting and who couldn't. Consider the scale of the problem each government faced in 1853 and 1854. Britain's peacetime military budget had been shrinking for years, a peace dividend from decades without a major continental war. France under Napoleon was rebuilding its army and navy, but doing so on a treasury still recovering from earlier political upheaval. Russia's finances were, by most contemporary accounts, the most fragile of the great powers, an empire vast in territory but thin in liquid capital, dependent on foreign bondholders for years before a single shot was fired at Sevastopol. And the Ottoman Empire, the nominal reason the war was being fought at all, was so deeply indebted to European creditors that its ability to wage war depended entirely on those same creditors' willingness to keep lending. In other words, every party to this war needed the same small circle of financiers, including, in a sense, each other's enemies. That's not a footnote. That's the entire hidden architecture of this war, and almost no one alive today was ever taught to look for it. By the 1850s, European government finance ran through a small, tightly interconnected network of private banking houses. Firms like Baring Brothers in London, the Rothschild banking network, spanning London, Paris, and Frankfurt. And Hambros, a rising London house with deep ties to the Scandinavian and Russian bond markets. These were not lenders in the way we think of banks today. They were underwriters, firms that took a government's promise to repay, packaged it into a tradable bond, and sold it to investors across Europe, taking a fee and often a stake for themselves along the way. The mechanics mattered enormously, so it's worth walking through them slowly. A war loan wasn't simply handed over as cash. A banking house would agree to underwrite an issue, say, several £1 million in government bonds, meaning the house guaranteed the government would receive the funds up front, then took on the job and the risk of selling those bonds onward to investors across the continent. The government got its money immediately. The banking house got a fee for the guarantee, and typically purchased the bonds itself at a discount before reselling them at face value or better. If the bonds sold well, if investor confidence in that government's ability to repay stayed high, the underwriting house profited handsomely from the spread. If they sold poorly, if confidence cracked, the house absorbed the loss and its own reputation took the hit. This single fact explains almost everything that follows. The banking houses were not neutral intermediaries standing outside the conflict. They had every incentive to manage public confidence in a war's outcome, because that confidence directly determined how easily they could offload the paper they'd underwritten. A rumor of Russian collapse could move bond prices in London by the hour. A rumor of British military disaster could do the same in reverse. The men managing these houses were not merely financing the war. They were, in a very real sense, managing its narrative, because the narrative was the product they were selling. When Britain and France declared war on Russia in 1854, all three needed money immediately, and Russia needed it just as badly. The Ottoman Empire, ostensibly the party being defended, was in the worst financial position of all, a state so indebted it would soon require its own emergency loans just to remain a functioning combatant in a war fought nominally on its behalf. Ottoman finances by this point were already propped up by European loans arranged years earlier, and the war only accelerated the empire's dependence on foreign capital, a dependence that would, within a generation, tip into outright financial control by a European creditor commission overseeing Ottoman revenue collection directly. This is where the banking houses stepped in. British war loans were floated through the London markets, with the direct involvement of firms tied to Baring and Rothschild interests, sold to a domestic investing public eager for the security of government paper, backed by the world's dominant naval power. These loans were typically issued at a discount to face value, with a fixed annual interest rate, giving ordinary British investors, clergymen, widows, retired officers, a patriotic-sounding, government-guaranteed place to park their savings while war fever ran high. French loans moved through Paris houses with parallel connections to the same Rothschild network. The family's position spanning both capitals meant they were, in effect, present on both sides of the Anglo-French alliance's financing, even as that alliance stood formally opposed to Russia. This wasn't contradiction. It was simply how the business worked. A bank with offices in both Allied capitals financed both Allied governments and took a fee from each, and Russia's own financing told an even stranger story. Despite being the enemy in the field, Russian state bonds continued to trade on European markets throughout the war, bought and sold by investors, and in some cases facilitated by the same broad network of European finance houses, who calculated that Russia would eventually settle its debts regardless of the war's outcome. The bond markets, in other words, did not take sides, they took positions. A Russian bond didn't stop paying interest just because Russian and British soldiers were killing each other in the Crimea. It stopped paying interest only if Russia collapsed entirely as a state, and almost no one in London or Paris was betting on that. While soldiers died at Sevastopol, while diplomats postured in Paris and London, the ledgers of Europe's banking houses had already priced in every possible outcome of the war, victory, defeat, stalemate, because a properly structured government bond pays interest regardless of who wins. That is the detail the battlefield version of this story always leaves out. The war had two outcomes for the men fighting it: win or lose. It had only one outcome for the men financing it: paid. To understand how this worked, you have to understand who these bankers actually were, not caricatures. Men deeply embedded in the political establishments of the very governments borrowing from them. Baring Brothers had, for decades, functioned almost as an unofficial arm of the British Treasury, with partners who moved fluidly between banking and government service, and relationships with cabinet ministers that made the firm privy to policy decisions before the public, and often before Parliament itself knew of them. A Baring partner sitting down to dinner with a sitting cabinet minister was not an unusual event. It was, in effect, part of how British war finance functioned. The firm's reputation for stability was so entrenched that decades later, a European statesman would famously remark that there were 6 great powers in Europe, and Baring Brothers. The Rothschild houses operated on an even larger scale, with brothers and cousins positioned in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples, giving the family a genuinely unique vantage point. Real-time knowledge of political and military developments across every major power involved in the conflict, arriving via private courier networks that, in the 1850s, could outpace official government dispatches. Information in this era was itself a form of capital, and no private institution possessed more of it than the Rothschild network. A shift in Russian troop positions, a change in French political sentiment, an Ottoman default rumor. All of it reached Rothschild desks in multiple capitals before it reached the newspapers, and often before it reached rival governments' own foreign ministries. This is not a claim that any one family orchestrated the war. Wars are never that simple, and reducing complex geopolitics to a single hidden hand is exactly the kind of oversimplification this channel exists to push back against. What is documented, however, is something more precise, and in some ways more unsettling. These banking houses did not need to start the war to profit enormously from it. They needed only to be positioned with capital, with information, with access before it began. And they were. Consider the asymmetry at the heart of this. A government minister deciding whether to escalate or negotiate had to weigh public opinion, military readiness, and shifting diplomatic alliances, variables that changed weekly and were often clouded by incomplete or delayed information. A banking house deciding whether to underwrite the next round of war bonds had a simpler calculation. Was the borrowing government still solvent enough and still popular enough with investors to sell the paper? That calculation didn't require predicting the war's outcome. It only required predicting investor confidence, a far more manageable variable, and one the banking houses themselves had significant power to shape through their own public conduct, their own willingness to keep buying, their own quiet signals to the market. Here's the part even most banking historians skip. The same houses financing the war were, simultaneously, in negotiations over the post-war reconstruction loans that Russia and the Ottoman Empire would need the moment the fighting stopped. Preliminary discussions about Ottoman financial restructuring were already circulating in European banking correspondence well before the armistice, and Russian access to European capital markets, cut off in the most acute phase of hostilities, was expected correctly, as it turned out, to reopen quickly once peace was signed, because punishing a major sovereign borrower indefinitely served no lender's interest. The war had not yet ended, and the men who financed it were already pricing in what came next. It's worth pausing here on a pattern that would repeat itself, decades later, in far more dramatic form. In 1890, Baring Brothers itself would nearly collapse after overextending on Argentine sovereign bonds, a crisis serious enough that the Bank of England had to organize an emergency rescue to prevent a full-blown financial panic. The very mechanism that made these houses so profitable during the Crimean War, profiting from sovereign debt regardless of political outcome, was the same mechanism that, when it finally miscalculated, nearly brought the whole system down. Crimea showed the model working. 1890 showed what happened when it didn't. Now, back to that ledger entry. The correspondence dated in the autumn of 1854 concerned a projected return on a bond issuance tied to the war's financing, a calculation of interest income assuming the conflict extended through a second campaigning season rather than resolving quickly. In plain terms, the banking house in question had modeled out what happened to their returns if the war dragged on, and a longer war from a pure lending perspective was the better outcome. More bonds, more interest. More fees on refinancing, as each government's initial war loans proved insufficient and new ones had to be floated. This is worth sitting with. The generals wanted the war to end. The soldiers wanted the war to end. The public reading casualty reports from a war correspondent for the first time in history, since the Crimean War was among the first conflicts covered by journalists filing dispatches nearly in real time, increasingly wanted the war to end. And yet, buried in a private ledger, someone had calculated in cold arithmetic that their own interests were better served by delay. The war did drag on, through the brutal winter siege of Sevastopol. Through disease and exposure that killed more soldiers than combat did. Through nearly 2 full years before an armistice was finally signed in 1856. And when the final accounting was done, the financing costs borne by all parties dwarfed the original military budgets each government had projected at the war's outset. A pattern that, as we'll see, was not unique to Crimea, but was arguably first demonstrated at this scale here, in a war remembered for a cavalry charge and a nurse, not for its ledgers. The correspondence quoted at the top of this video, the line describing the war, in the private language of one banking house, as simply good business, was not a boast. It was an internal assessment, dry and clinical, of a transaction that happened to involve the deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the other side of a continent. Good business, that's the phrase, not victory, not glory, business. The Crimean War is remembered today, if it's remembered at all, for 2 things: a doomed cavalry charge immortalized in verse, and a nurse named Florence Nightingale who transformed battlefield medicine. It is almost never remembered as what it also was, one of the first modern demonstrations that a war's true cost and its true beneficiaries could be entirely decoupled from who actually won it. That template didn't disappear in 1856. It became the standard. Every major conflict since has required the same basic financial architecture. Governments unable to fund a war from tax revenue alone, turning to private capital markets to bridge the gap, and in doing so, creating a class of institutions with a direct financial stake in how long and how expensively that war is fought. You can trace the same structure through the financing of the American Civil War a decade later, when Union and Confederate bonds alike found their way onto European markets, each side courting the same pool of foreign capital. Through the war bonds of two world wars in the century that followed, sold not just to institutions, but to ordinary citizens as a patriotic duty, turning entire populations into small-scale creditors of their own government's war efforts. Through the sovereign debt crises that still follow armed conflict today, when post-war reconstruction loans arrive with conditions attached, decided in boardrooms thousands of miles from the destruction they're meant to repair, the battlefield changes, the uniforms change, the technology changes almost beyond recognition. The ledger does not. While soldiers still die in wars fought for reasons splashed across headlines, the ledgers behind those wars are still, quietly, doing the same arithmetic they did in 1854. Pricing risk, pricing duration, pricing outcome, indifferent to which flag ends up planted where. So here's the question this channel always ends on, and it's worth sitting with this time in particular. If you can look at a 170-year-old war, fought over a handful of shrines and a collapsing empire, and find a paper trail showing the financiers had already calculated their returns before the first shot was fired, what makes you so certain that pattern hasn't simply gotten better at hiding itself since? Tell me in the comments which modern conflict you think fits this same pattern. I suspect you already have one in mind.